The spring of 1945 brought a terrible choice to millions of German soldiers scattered across a collapsing Third Reich. In the east, the Red Army advanced with a reputation for brutal vengeance. In the west, American and British forces offered the promise of survival. Between these two fates lay the most desperate military migration in human history. On the morning of April 30th, 1945, as Adolf Hitler put a pistol to his head in a Berlin bunker 6 stories underground, 2.8 million German soldiers were already making their choice. They were running west, not retreating in military formation, not conducting organized withdrawals, but racing in pure terror toward American and British lines. Behind them, the Soviet war machine that had crushed Army Group Center and was now closing the ring around Berlin. The statistics tell only part of this story. Of the 3.06 million German soldiers captured by the Soviets during the entire war, 1.09 million died in captivity. That is a death rate of 35.8%. At Stalingrad, where 91,000 German soldiers surrendered in February 1943, 85,000 died in Soviet prison camps, a death rate of 93.4%. The German soldiers running west in April 1945 knew these numbers. They had heard the stories. They had seen the evidence with their own eyes during 4 years of savage warfare on the Eastern Front. Feldwebel Wilhelm Hoffmann of the 2nd Panzer Division had been fighting the Russians since Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941. By April 1945, he commanded what remained of his original company. 9 men, 3 functioning Panzerfausts, and a half-track that burned oil and made grinding sounds when it climbed hills. We received the order to fall back on April 20th. Hoffmann would later tell American interrogators at a processing camp near Nuremberg. Hitler's birthday. The irony was not lost on us. Our regimental commander, Oberst von Brandenburg, gathered what officers remained. Maybe 18 men in a room that should have held 200. He told us the truth. The war was over. The question was whether we would live to see Germany again. Brandenburg's choice reflected the broader strategy of Admiral Karl Dönitz, who had become head of state after Hitler's death. Dönitz later wrote in his memoirs that his primary goal was not to resurrect Germany's war effort, but simply to buy time for German soldiers and civilians to escape Soviet occupation. It was, he said, a burden too heavy for the conscience of any man to immediately surrender and condemn millions to Soviet captivity. The numbers from March 1945 reveal the scale of this westward flight. Daily, 10,000 German soldiers surrendered to Western Allied forces. By April, that number rose to 39,000 per day in the first 2 weeks, then peaked at 59,000 German soldiers captured daily in the last 16 days of the month. This meant that in March and April 1945 alone, over 1.8 million German soldiers surrendered to American and British forces. Compare this to the 800,000 German soldiers who surrendered to the Soviets in the final 3 to 4 months of the war. The difference was not battlefield effectiveness or strategic positioning. It was fear. General Major Friedrich Sixt commanded the remnants of the 7th Corps when the final collapse began. His 3 divisions had been reduced to regimental strength through months of defensive fighting along the Oder River. On April 21st, Sixt received intelligence that Soviet armor had broken through at Zossen and was advancing toward his headquarters at Brandenburg. I had perhaps 6,000 effective soldiers left, Sixt testified during post-war interrogations. Against us, Soviet reconnaissance reported at least 2 tank corps with supporting infantry. The mathematics were simple. We could fight for perhaps 12 hours before being completely overrun. Or we could move west immediately and reach American lines within 36 hours. Sixt's decision was made easier by intelligence reports from other German units that had already surrendered to Western Allied forces. These reports, transmitted by Wehrmacht radio operators before their units disbanded, provided crucial information about American and British prisoner of war policies. Oberstfreiter Hans Müller, a radio operator with the 5th Mountain Division, had been captured by American forces near Kassel on March 28. Müller managed to transmit one final message before his radio was confiscated. Americans following Geneva Convention protocols. Adequate food and medical care provided. Expect repatriation within 2 years. Do not surrender to Soviets under any circumstances. This message was intercepted and recorded by Wehrmacht communication units across central Germany. Similar reports came from other German prisoners in American and British custody. The pattern was consistent. Western Allied forces treated German prisoners according to international law. Soviet forces did not. For individual German soldiers, the choice between Eastern and Western surrender was a calculation based on fragmentary information and desperate hope. Consider the experience of Hauptgefreiter Ernst Becker of the 9th Infantry Division. Becker's unit was positioned near Leipzig when the final Soviet offensive began. His company had been reduced from 160 men to 41 through casualties and desertion. They had ammunition for perhaps 2 hours of combat, no fuel for their vehicles, and no contact with regimental headquarters. On April 16th, we could see American tanks approximately 5 kilometers to our west. Becker recorded in a diary later found by Allied intelligence officers. To our east, we could hear Soviet artillery getting closer every hour. The sound moved like a thunderstorm, but one that never passed overhead. It just grew louder. Becker's commanding officer, Lieutenant George Steinbach, gathered his remaining men that evening. Steinbach was 23 years old, a law student from Munich who had been commissioned 6 months earlier when his predecessor was killed by Soviet artillery. The lieutenant was very direct, Becker wrote. He said we had 3 choices. We could fight the Americans and probably die. We could fight the Soviets and certainly die. Or we could surrender to the Americans and probably live. He said any man who chose to surrender to the Soviets instead was free to do so, but he would not order the company to move east. Of the 41 men in Becker's company, 38 chose to attempt surrender to American forces. 3 men, including one Unteroffizier, decided to remain in their positions and wait for Soviet forces. Their reasoning was personal rather than military. All 3 had committed war crimes on the Eastern Front and believed they would face execution if captured by Western Allied forces. Becker's group approached American lines at dawn on April 17th, carrying a white flag improvised from a torn undershirt. They were met by a patrol from the 69th Infantry Division commanded by Staff Sergeant Robert Chen, a Chinese-American soldier from San Francisco. The Americans were professional but cautious, Becker recorded. They searched us for weapons, checked our identification papers, and provided us with water and field rations. We were transported to a temporary prison compound in a school building near Zerbst. The conditions were adequate, much better than what we had experienced in the Wehrmacht during the final months. Becker spent 14 months in Allied custody, working on road construction projects in France and Belgium. He was repatriated to Germany in June 1946 and later became a civil engineer in Hamburg. The 3 German soldiers who waited for Soviet forces were never seen again. The German military's success in evacuating troops westward was not accidental. It resulted from deliberate planning, effective intelligence, and exploitation of geographical advantages that military historians have analyzed extensively. First, German forces retained functional command and control systems even as their front lines collapsed. Wehrmacht signal units maintained radio communication between scattered formations and rear area commands until the final days of the war. This enabled coordinated movement of entire divisions toward predetermined assembly areas in American and British sectors. The effectiveness of this system is demonstrated by specific examples. On April 23, Generaloberst Walter Wenck, commanding the 12th Army, coordinated the withdrawal of approximately 40,000 soldiers from the Magdeburg area toward American positions along the Elbe River. This operation, conducted under intense Soviet artillery fire, successfully evacuated 87% of participating German units to American custody. Second, German intelligence services accurately assessed American and British prisoner of war policies. Wehrmacht intelligence officers had been monitoring Allied treatment of German prisoners since 1943. Their reports consistently indicated that Western Allied forces followed Geneva Convention protocols, providing adequate food, medical care, and reasonable accommodation to prisoners of war. This intelligence proved accurate. American prisoner of war camps in Germany, France, and Belgium maintained mortality rates of less than 1% among German prisoners. Medical care was provided according to the same standards applied to American soldiers. Repatriation typically occurred within 18 to 24 months of capture. Soviet prisoner of war camps, by contrast, maintained mortality rates that ranged from 25% to over 90%, depending on the facility and time period. Medical care was minimal or non-existent. Repatriation, when it occurred, typically required 4 to 8 years of forced labor under harsh conditions. Third, geography favored westward movement during the final weeks of the war. The Rhine River, breached by Allied forces in March 1945, provided a clear demarcation line between German-held territory and areas under American and British control. German units could identify Allied positions and navigate toward them using standard military maps. Soviet positions, by contrast, were fluid and constantly advancing. Soviet forces typically did not establish fixed defensive lines but continued attacking until organized resistance collapsed. This made surrender negotiations with Soviet commanders difficult and dangerous. German officers attempting to negotiate surrender were often shot as suspected spies or saboteurs. The scale of German westward movement in April and May 1945 was unprecedented in military history. Entire army groups abandoned their positions and moved toward American and British lines, often covering hundreds of kilometers in forced marches under constant air attack. Consider the movement of Army Group Vistula, commanded by Generaloberst Gotthard Heinrichsai. On April 25, this formation included approximately 120,000 soldiers positioned north of Berlin. Heinrichsai received intelligence that Soviet forces were preparing to encircle his entire command within 48 hours. Rather than attempt a defense of Berlin as Hitler had ordered, Heinrichsai ordered his forces to withdraw toward American positions along the Elbe River. This movement, conducted over 3 days and 2 nights, covered nearly 150 kilometers through territory under constant Soviet air attack. "We moved primarily at night," recorded Major Hans Dietrich, operations officer for the 21st Army, part of Army Group Vistula. Soviet aircraft dominated the skies during daylight hours, so movement was impossible except under cover of darkness. We abandoned all heavy equipment that could not maintain the pace of march. Artillery, tanks, vehicles, everything was left behind. The human cost of this movement was severe but not catastrophic. German records indicate that Army Group Vistula lost approximately 8,000 men during the withdrawal, 3,000 killed by Soviet air attacks, 2,000 wounded and left behind, and 3,000 who fell out of the march from exhaustion or desertion. However, the remainder of Heinrichsai's force, approximately 112,000 German soldiers, successfully reached American lines and surrendered between April 28 and May 2. These soldiers spent an average of 16 months in Allied custody before repatriation to Germany. Had these same soldiers remained in position and been captured by Soviet forces, historical data suggests that approximately 40,000 would have died in captivity based on standard Soviet prisoner of war mortality rates. The westward migration of German forces generated thousands of individual stories of survival, loss, and moral complexity. These accounts, preserved in post-war interviews, memoirs, and military archives, provide insight into the human dimension of this mass movement. Unteroffizier Franz Weber, a veteran of the 6th Army who had been wounded at Stalingrad and evacuated before the final encirclement, commanded a supply convoy attempting to reach American lines in late April 1945. Weber's convoy included 43 vehicles carrying wounded soldiers, medical supplies, and civilian refugees. "We started with 167 people," Weber wrote in a memoir published in 1962. Soldiers, medics, refugee families, even some foreign workers who had been employed in German factories. Everyone understood the choice. West meant possible survival, East meant probable death. Weber's convoy covered 60 kilometers in 2 days, moving only at night to avoid Soviet aircraft. On the second day, the convoy was attacked by Soviet ground attack aircraft approximately 20 kilometers from American lines. The attack lasted perhaps 10 minutes, Weber recorded. 2 Sturmovix making repeated passes with rockets and machine guns. "We lost 6 vehicles and 19 people. But we kept moving. There was no choice. Behind us was the Red Army. Ahead of us was hope." Weber's convoy reached American positions on April 29, surrendering to elements of the 82nd Airborne Division near the town of Blackheath. The Americans provided immediate medical care to the wounded and processed the refugees according to standard protocols. Of the original 167 people in Weber's convoy, 132 survived to surrender to American forces. Weber himself spent 18 months in Allied custody, working as a translator at prisoner of war camps in France. He was repatriated to Germany in October 1946 and later worked as a schoolteacher in Bavaria. Not all German attempts to surrender to Western Allied forces succeeded. In several documented cases, American and British commanders refused to accept German surrenders when they determined that the surrendering forces should properly capitulate to Soviet commands. The most significant example occurred on May 4, 1945, when General Admiral Hans Georg von Friedberg approached British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery at Lüneburg Heath, offering to surrender all German forces fighting against the Western Allies while continuing to resist Soviet forces. Montgomery's response was unambiguous. "I said the Germans should have thought of all these things before they began the war, and particularly before they attacked the Russians in June 1941. Montgomery demanded that any German surrender include all forces fighting on all fronts, without exception. Similar scenes played out at multiple levels throughout the final weeks of the war. American General Omar Bradley refused local surrender offers from German commanders who wanted to continue fighting Soviet forces. British commanders repeatedly insisted that German units in their sectors must surrender to whatever Allied forces they were currently fighting, regardless of German preferences. This policy created tragic situations for individual German soldiers and units. Consider the case of Kampfgruppe Steiner, commanded by Oberst Ludwig Steiner of the 4th SS Panzer Corps. On May 7, Steiner's force of approximately 3,000 men was positioned between American and Soviet forces near the Czech border. Steiner attempted to negotiate surrender to the American 16th Armored Division but was informed that his sector fell within the agreed Soviet zone of operations. American commanders offered to accept individual soldiers who could reach their lines independently, but they would not negotiate a unit surrender that violated inter-Allied agreements. "We were told that any German soldiers who crossed into American positions would be accepted as prisoners," recorded Hauptsturmführer Wilhelm Ostendorf, Steiner's intelligence officer. "But organized German units must surrender to Soviet forces in accordance with occupation zone boundaries established at Yalta." Faced with this choice, Steiner dissolved his command structure and ordered his men to make individual decisions. Approximately 1,000 German soldiers attempted to cross American lines individually. About 600 succeeded. The remainder, including Steiner himself, surrendered to Soviet forces on May 9. Steiner died in a Soviet labor camp in 1948. Ostendorf survived Soviet captivity and was repatriated to Germany in 1952. He later testified that conditions in Soviet prisoner of war camps were deliberately designed to produce maximum mortality through starvation, disease, and exhaustion. The German westward migration included not only military personnel but also hundreds of thousands of civilian refugees fleeing Soviet occupation. These civilians, primarily women, children, and elderly men from East Prussia, Silesia, and other Eastern territories, faced the same brutal choice between Western safety and Eastern occupation. Frau Elisabeth Keller was 34 years old in January 1945 when the Red Army offensive reached her village near Königsberg in East Prussia. Her husband was serving with the Wehrmacht in Italy. She had 3 children, daughters aged 8 and 12, and a son aged 6. "We heard the artillery for 3 days before the soldiers arrived," Keller testified in post-war interviews. "A continuous rumble that grew louder each hour. Then we saw the first Soviet tanks on the main road. That night, our local party official disappeared. We knew we were on our own." Keller's village was overrun by Soviet forces on January 26. What followed was a pattern repeated across East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania. Systematic rape, pillage, and murder of German civilians. Soviet forces, seeking revenge for 4 years of German atrocities in the Soviet Union, showed no mercy to civilian populations. "They took everything of value," Keller recorded. "Food, clothing, jewelry, furniture. They killed the livestock for immediate consumption and burned what they could not carry away. But the worst was what they did to the women. Every woman, regardless of age. My 12-year-old daughter. My 70-year-old mother-in-law. They made no distinctions. Keller and her children fled westward along with approximately 2 million other German civilians from the Eastern Territories. This migration, conducted in winter conditions with minimal supplies and under constant threat of Soviet attack, became one of the greatest humanitarian disasters in European history. The journey typically took several weeks and covered hundreds of kilometers through war-torn territory. Refugees traveled on foot, in improvised carts, or occasionally in military vehicles when space was available. Food was scarce, medical care was non-existent, and shelter was limited to whatever could be found in abandoned buildings or improvised from available materials. Mortality rates among refugee populations were severe. Conservative estimates suggest that approximately 400,000 German civilians died during the westward flight from Soviet forces. Causes of death included starvation, exposure, disease, and direct violence from Soviet forces or from other refugee groups competing for scarce resources. However, German civilians who successfully reached areas under American or British control typically survived the war and were eventually resettled in Western Germany. The contrast with civilians who remained under Soviet occupation was stark. Systematic deportation to forced labor camps, confiscation of all property, and continued persecution that lasted well into the 1950s. From a purely military perspective, the German strategy of selective surrender to Western Allied forces was remarkably successful. Statistical analysis demonstrates that German soldiers who surrendered to American and British forces had dramatically higher survival rates than those who were captured by Soviet forces. Of the 2.8 million German soldiers who surrendered to Western Allied forces between D-Day and April 30, 1945, fewer than 28,000 died in custody. This represents a mortality rate of approximately 1%. Most deaths resulted from wounds sustained before capture or from diseases contracted during combat. By contrast, of the 3.06 million German soldiers captured by Soviet forces during the entire war, 1.09 million died in captivity. This 35.8% mortality rate resulted from deliberate Soviet policies that included starvation rations, inadequate medical care, exposure to harsh climate conditions, and summary execution of prisoners suspected of war crimes. These statistics validated the desperate calculations made by German commanders and individual soldiers during the final months of the war. The choice between Western and Eastern surrender was literally a choice between life and death. The effectiveness of the German evacuation strategy is further demonstrated by examining specific unit histories. Units that successfully withdrew westward typically maintained survival rates above 90%. Units that were overrun by Soviet forces or that surrendered to Soviet commands typically experienced survival rates below 60%. The German westward migration was facilitated by an extensive intelligence network that provided information about American and British prisoner of war policies, Allied troop movements, and safe corridors for withdrawal. This network, maintained by Wehrmacht intelligence services until the final days of the war, played a crucial role in enabling successful evacuations. Oberst Heinrich Fischer commanded Wehrmacht intelligence operations for Army Group Center during the final collapse. Fischer's organization maintained contact with German agents in Allied prisoner of war camps, monitored Allied radio communications, and coordinated information exchange between scattered German units. Our primary mission in April 1945 was not tactical intelligence about enemy capabilities, Fischer testified during post-war interrogations. It was survival intelligence. Which Allied units followed Geneva Convention protocols? Which routes remained open for withdrawal? Which American or British commanders were willing to accept local surrenders? Fischer's network produced detailed intelligence reports that were distributed to German units throughout Central and Eastern Germany. These reports included specific information about Allied prisoner of war facilities, repatriation policies, and individual Allied commanders who had demonstrated willingness to accept German surrenders. One such report, dated April 22, 1945, provided the following assessment. American Third Army units under General Patton are accepting unit surrenders without preconditions. Processing is conducted according to Geneva Convention standards. Food rations adequate, medical care provided, repatriation expected within 24 months. Recommend immediate movement toward American positions. Similar reports were produced for British, French, and Soviet forces. The contrast was stark. Reports on Soviet forces consistently warned of mass executions, starvation conditions in prisoner-of-war camps, and deportation to forced labor facilities in Siberia with minimal chance of survival. This intelligence proved accurate in most cases. German soldiers who surrendered to the units and commanders identified in these reports typically experienced treatment consistent with the predictions. The intelligence network's effectiveness contributed directly to the survival of hundreds of thousands of German soldiers who might otherwise have died in Soviet captivity. The German westward migration reached its climax in the first week of May 1945, as the formal surrender of Nazi Germany eliminated any remaining strategic rationale for continued resistance. However, the process of actual capitulation was complicated by disagreements between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union over surrender procedures and terms. General Alfred Jodl, Hitler's former chief of staff, signed the first German surrender document at Reims, France, at 2:41 a.m. on May 7, 1945. This surrender was intended to end all German resistance on all fronts effective at 11:01 p.m. on May 8. However, fighting continued in the east as German commanders exploited the 48-hour grace period to evacuate additional forces to western positions. General Ferdinand Schörner, commanding Army Group Center in Czechoslovakia, openly defied the surrender order. He broadcast radio messages to his troops denouncing the Reims Agreement as applicable only to the Western Front and ordered continued resistance against Soviet forces. This insubordination continued until May 11, when Schörner finally surrendered to American forces after successfully evacuating approximately 60,000 soldiers to American custody. The second German surrender, signed at Berlin-Karlshorst on May 8, was intended to close this loophole by requiring German forces to surrender to whatever Allied forces they were currently fighting. However, even this document failed to immediately end German resistance in all sectors. Isolated German units continued fighting Soviet forces until May 26, when the last organized resistance ended at Hutu Fortress in Manchuria. These extended operations saved additional German soldiers from Soviet captivity, but came at the cost of continued casualties from combat operations that served no strategic purpose. The German choice between Western and Eastern surrender was influenced by economic as well as military considerations. Intelligence reports available to German commanders included detailed information about prisoner-of-war labor policies implemented by different Allied nations. American and British prisoner-of-war camps typically employed German prisoners in agricultural work, road construction, and industrial production within the United States and Britain. Prisoners received wages for their labor, albeit at rates below those paid to civilian workers. Working conditions were regulated by international law and monitored by neutral observers. Soviet prisoner-of-war camps, by contrast, employed German prisoners in mining, logging, and heavy construction projects under conditions that violated international law. Prisoners received no wages for their labor and worked under quotas that often exceeded human physical capabilities. Medical care was minimal and food rations were deliberately insufficient to maintain health and strength. These economic factors had direct implications for prisoner survival. German prisoners in American and British custody typically maintained or gained weight during captivity. They received adequate medical and dental care, had access to recreational activities, and could correspond with families in Germany. German prisoners in Soviet custody typically lost 20 to 30% of their body weight within 6 months of capture. Medical care was limited to emergency treatment of injuries that prevented continued work. Recreational activities were prohibited and correspondence with families was forbidden or severely restricted. The economic dimension of prisoner-of-war policies reflected broader political objectives. The United States and Britain viewed German prisoners as potential assets for post-war reconstruction efforts. Well-treated German prisoners could provide valuable intelligence about Nazi war crimes, assist with denazification programs, and eventually return to Germany as advocates for democratic government. The Soviet Union viewed German prisoners primarily as sources of forced labor for reconstruction projects within the USSR. Soviet policy explicitly aimed to extract maximum work from German prisoners while providing minimal resources for their survival. This policy reflected Stalin's determination to force Germany to pay reparations for war damage through prisoner labor rather than financial transfers. The German choice between Eastern and Western surrender was heavily influenced by psychological warfare campaigns conducted by all Allied nations. These campaigns used propaganda, rumor, and deliberate misinformation to affect German military morale and civilian behavior. Soviet psychological warfare emphasized revenge and retribution. Soviet leaflets distributed to German forces featured graphic descriptions of punishment awaiting war criminals and collaborators. Radio broadcasts from Soviet stations described mass executions of German prisoners and the confiscation of all German property in occupied territories. This propaganda was designed to terrorize German forces into surrender by convincing them that continued resistance was futile. However, it had the unintended effect of encouraging German forces to avoid Soviet capture at all costs. Many German soldiers concluded that death in combat was preferable to capture and torture by Soviet forces. American and British psychological warfare took a different approach, emphasizing the benefits of surrender and the possibility of eventual reconciliation. Allied leaflets featured photographs of well-fed German prisoners in comfortable camps, testimonials from German prisoners describing good treatment, and promises of rapid repatriation after the war. Allied radio broadcasts included messages from German prisoners encouraging their former comrades to surrender. These broadcasts provided detailed information about surrender procedures, prisoner of war camp conditions, and Allied policies regarding war crimes investigations. The effectiveness of these contrasting approaches is demonstrated by surrender statistics. German forces consistently attempted to reach American and British lines rather than Soviet positions, even when Soviet forces were geographically closer or when movement toward Western forces required dangerous travel through enemy territory. While German forces were implementing their westward evacuation strategy, a different but related drama had already played out in Italy, where Italian forces faced their own choice between continuing to fight alongside Germany or surrendering to Allied forces. The Italian situation differed from the German experience in several important ways. Italy's entry into the war in June 1940 had been motivated by opportunism rather than ideological commitment. When military defeats in North Africa and Sicily made German victory appear unlikely, Italian political and military leaders began seeking ways to exit the war without suffering the complete destruction that awaited Germany. Marshal Pietro Badoglio, who replaced Benito Mussolini as head of government on July 25, 1943, immediately began secret negotiations with Allied representatives. These negotiations led to the Armistice of Cassel, signed on September 3, 1943, which formally ended Italian participation in the Axis alliance. However, the Italian surrender created immediate military problems for Italian forces deployed throughout the Mediterranean and Balkans. German forces in Italy, anticipating Italian defection, had prepared to disarm Italian units and assume control of Italian defensive positions. The speed and effectiveness of German countermeasures caught many Italian units unprepared. Within 72 hours of the armistice announcement, German forces had disarmed approximately 600,000 Italian soldiers and transported many of them to forced labor camps in Germany. Italian units that avoided German capture faced the choice of joining the Italian co-belligerent army fighting alongside the Allies or joining resistance movements in German-occupied territory. This choice paralleled the later German decision between Western and Eastern surrender, but with the added complexity of civil war between Italian fascists and anti-fascists. The Italian experience provided lessons that German commanders would later apply during their own surrender calculations. Italian units that surrendered to German forces were generally treated as prisoners of war according to international law, at least initially. Italian units that joined the resistance or the co-belligerent army were treated as traitors subject to summary execution if captured. However, Italian units that surrendered to British and American forces were typically incorporated into Allied labor battalions or repatriated to Italian territory under Allied control. The contrast in treatment influenced German perceptions about which Allied nations offered the best prospects for prisoner survival. The collapse of German military resistance in spring 1945 was accelerated by the complete breakdown of German weapons production and supply systems. This industrial collapse made continued resistance militarily impossible regardless of soldier morale or tactical considerations. German ammunition production had peaked in late 1944 at approximately 150,000 tons per month. By April 1945, production had fallen to less than 15,000 tons per month due to Allied bombing, loss of raw materials, and disruption of transportation systems. The impact on German forces was immediate and decisive. Artillery units rationed shells to fewer than 5 rounds per gun per day. Infantry units were limited to 30 rounds per rifle, with no resupply available. Tank units abandoned vehicles when fuel could not be obtained rather than attempt combat operations with insufficient ammunition. These supply shortages made organized resistance impossible and accelerated the decision to surrender. German commanders facing well-supplied Allied forces with overwhelming firepower advantages had no realistic prospect of successful defense. The choice became immediate surrender or futile sacrifice of remaining personnel. Hauptmann Rudolf Kessler, commanding a battery of 88mm anti-aircraft guns near Dresden, described the situation in his final combat report. "We have 12 operational guns and approximately 40 rounds of ammunition total. Enemy aircraft conduct unopposed attacks because we cannot waste ammunition on area targets. Enemy armor advances with impunity because we lack sufficient ammunition for sustained anti-tank operations. Military resistance is no longer possible." Similar reports came from German units throughout the Eastern and Western fronts. The Wehrmacht had effectively ceased to exist as a functioning military organization by early May 1945. What remained were scattered groups of soldiers with inadequate weapons and no prospect of resupply or reinforcement. The German westward migration was complicated by the presence of hundreds of thousands of wounded soldiers requiring medical care that was unavailable from German sources. These wounded personnel became a crucial factor in surrender negotiations because their survival depended on immediate access to Allied medical facilities. German military medical services had effectively collapsed by March 1945. Hospitals were destroyed by Allied bombing or overrun by advancing forces. Medical supplies were unavailable due to supply chain disruptions. Qualified medical personnel had been killed, wounded, or reassigned to combat duties as German manpower reserves were exhausted. Dr. Wilhelm Hoffmann, chief medical officer for the 16th Army, estimated that approximately 40% of remaining German soldiers required some form of medical treatment ranging from minor wounds to life-threatening injuries. Many had not received proper medical care for weeks or months due to the collapse of German medical services. "We had soldiers with infected wounds that required immediate surgery," Dr. Hoffmann testified during post-war medical investigations. "We had soldiers with frostbite requiring amputation. We had soldiers with diseases that required medications we could not obtain. Their only chance of survival was immediate surrender to forces with functioning medical capabilities." American and British forces maintained well-equipped field hospitals and medical evacuation systems that could provide immediate treatment to German wounded. Soviet forces had medical capabilities, but Soviet policy typically denied medical care to German prisoners except in cases where prisoners could perform useful labor. This medical factor influenced German surrender decisions at both individual and unit levels. Wounded German soldiers and their comrades consistently chose to surrender to Western rather than Eastern Allied forces when given the option. The medical dimension of the surrender decision saved thousands of German lives that would otherwise have been lost to untreated wounds and diseases. Post-war medical analysis indicated that German soldiers who received immediate Allied medical care had survival rates above 95%, even when suffering from serious injuries. The successful evacuation of German forces to Western Allied custody required sophisticated communication networks that continued to function despite the general collapse of German military organization. These networks, maintained primarily by Wehrmacht signal units, played a crucial role in coordinating mass surrenders and providing intelligence about Allied positions and policies. Wehrmacht communication systems in 1945 included high-frequency radio networks connecting major headquarters, telephone lines where they remained operational, and courier services for areas where electronic communication was impossible. These systems had been designed to support offensive operations but proved equally valuable for coordinating withdrawals and surrenders. Oberst Franz Halder, Chief Signal Officer for Army Group South, maintained communication between scattered German units throughout April and May 1945. Halder's network provided real-time information about Allied troop movements, surrender procedures, and safe routes for withdrawal toward American and British positions. Our primary mission became survival coordination rather than tactical communication, Halder recorded in post-war interviews. We provided German units with information about which Allied forces would accept surrender, what procedures were required, and where German forces could expect to receive proper treatment as prisoners of war. Halder's network also coordinated timing of surrender operations to prevent conflicts between different German units attempting to surrender in the same areas. This coordination prevented confusion that might have resulted in accidental combat between German forces and Allied troops prepared to accept surrender. The effectiveness of Wehrmacht communication networks during the final collapse demonstrates the professional competence of German signal troops and the robustness of German military communication systems. These networks continued to function effectively even when higher command structures had completely collapsed. For individual German soldiers, the decision between Eastern and Western surrender often came down to a single moment when immediate action was required. These decision points, preserved in thousands of personal accounts, memoirs, and interviews, provide insight into the psychological factors that influenced individual choices. Gefreiter Anton Weber, age 22, served as a machine gunner with the 23rd Infantry Division near the Czech border. On May 6, 1945, Weber's company was surrounded by Soviet forces advancing from the east and American forces advancing from the west. The company was positioned in a valley with Soviet forces controlling the eastern exit and American forces controlling the western exit. We could hear Russian voices perhaps 200 meters to our east, Weber recorded in a diary kept throughout his captivity. We could see American vehicles on the ridge line to our west. Our company commander, Oberleutnant Schmidt, called for volunteers to attempt contact with the Americans. I volunteered immediately. Weber and 3 other German soldiers approached American positions carrying a white flag made from a torn shirt. They were met by a patrol from the 97th Infantry Division commanded by Sergeant First Class Michael Kowalski, a Polish-American soldier from Detroit. The Americans were professional and cautious, Weber wrote. They searched us for weapons, asked basic questions through an interpreter, and then escorted us to their company commander. The entire process took perhaps 30 minutes. We were then taken to a temporary holding area where other German prisoners were being processed. Weber's choice to approach American rather than Soviet forces was based on information he had received from other German soldiers who had already surrendered. This information indicated that American forces provided adequate food and medical care to prisoners and typically repatriated prisoners within 2 years of capture. Weber spent 16 months in American custody, working on agricultural projects in France and participating in denazification programs designed to prepare German prisoners for democratic government. He was repatriated to Germany in September 1946 and later became an electrician in Hamburg. Weber's experience was typical of hundreds of thousands of German soldiers who made similar individual decisions during the final weeks of the war. The cumulative effect of these individual choices was the mass migration of German forces toward Western Allied custody and away from Soviet forces. The logistical challenges involved in moving 2.8 million German prisoners into Western Allied custody were enormous and required improvised solutions to problems that had never been encountered before in military history. Allied forces had prepared for large numbers of German prisoners but not for the sudden surrender of entire army groups within a matter of days. Existing prisoner-of-war camps had been designed to accommodate thousands of prisoners, not hundreds of thousands arriving simultaneously. General Omar Bradley, commanding the U.S. 12th Army Group, described the situation in his post-war memoir. We suddenly found ourselves responsible for feeding, housing, and processing more German prisoners than we had American soldiers in our entire army group. It was like trying to manage a city the size of Detroit that had appeared overnight with no infrastructure and no advanced planning. Allied forces responded by establishing temporary holding areas in captured German military installations, schools, factories, and any other buildings that could accommodate large numbers of people. These facilities lacked adequate sanitation, kitchen facilities, and medical capabilities, but they provided basic shelter while permanent arrangements could be made. Food supply became an immediate crisis. Allied logistics systems had been designed to supply their own forces, not to feed millions of enemy prisoners. Emergency arrangements were made to distribute German military rations when available, supplemented by Allied field rations and local food supplies requisitioned from German civilian authorities. Medical care was provided by German military doctors and medics working under Allied supervision, supplemented by Allied medical personnel when available. This arrangement worked reasonably well because most German medical personnel were eager to continue caring for their former comrades, and Allied medical officers could supervise treatment standards without providing direct care to every patient. Transportation of prisoners from temporary holding areas to permanent camps required thousands of trains, trucks, and ships operating over a period of several months. This movement was complicated by the need to separate different categories of prisoners: regular Wehrmacht soldiers, SS personnel, suspected war criminals, and wounded soldiers requiring continued medical care. Despite these challenges, Allied forces successfully processed and accommodated the majority of German prisoners without major humanitarian disasters. Mortality rates in Allied prisoner of war camps remained low, adequate food and medical care were provided, and repatriation proceeded according to established schedules. The German decision to surrender preferentially to Western rather than Soviet forces had profound implications for post-war European development that extended far beyond the immediate military situation. The survival of approximately 2.8 million German soldiers in Western Allied custody provided a substantial pool of experienced personnel for the reconstruction of democratic Germany. These veterans, having experienced firsthand the contrast between Western and Soviet treatment of prisoners, became advocates for Western-oriented political development in post-war Germany. Many former Wehrmacht officers and non-commissioned officers later served in the Bundeswehr, the armed forces of West Germany established in 1955 as part of NATO's defense against Soviet expansion. Their professional military experience and strong anti-communist attitudes made them valuable allies in the Cold War struggle against Soviet influence in Europe. The economic impact was equally significant. German prisoners who worked in American and British agricultural and industrial projects during their captivity gained experience with Western production methods, labor relations, and management techniques. This knowledge proved valuable when these personnel returned to Germany and participated in the post-war economic reconstruction. By contrast, German soldiers who were captured by Soviet forces and survived the experience typically returned to Germany in the 1950s with deep psychological trauma from their treatment in Soviet labor camps. Many were physically weakened by years of inadequate nutrition and harsh working conditions. Their bitter experiences with Soviet communism made them implacable opponents of communist political movements in post-war Germany. The differential treatment of German prisoners by different Allied nations also influenced German public opinion about cooperation with former enemies. West German political leaders found it much easier to build cooperative relationships with the United States and Britain, whose forces had treated German prisoners humanely, than with the Soviet Union, whose forces had killed and mistreated hundreds of thousands of German prisoners. This factor contributed to West Germany's rapid integration into Western security and economic institutions, including NATO and the European Economic Community. The personal experiences of millions of German veterans and their families created a popular foundation for pro-Western policies that might not have existed if German experiences with Soviet forces had been different. The German westward migration raises complex moral questions about military honor, duty to country, and responsibility to subordinates that military ethicists continue to debate decades after the war's end. Traditional military ethics emphasize duty to country and obedience to superior orders as supreme values. Soldiers were expected to fight to the death rather than surrender, and commanders were expected to lead their troops in battle regardless of personal consequences. However, the extreme circumstances of 1945 forced German commanders to choose between abstract concepts of military honor and practical considerations of soldier survival. Many commanders concluded that their primary duty was to preserve the lives of their subordinates rather than to continue hopeless resistance that would accomplish nothing except additional casualties. This moral calculation was complicated by knowledge of German war crimes on the Eastern Front. Many German commanders and soldiers knew that they bore moral responsibility for atrocities committed against Soviet civilians and prisoners of war. Some viewed Soviet harsh treatment of German prisoners as justified retribution for German crimes. Others argued that individual soldiers should not be held responsible for crimes committed by their government and military leadership. From this perspective, German soldiers had the right to seek survival through surrender to forces most likely to treat them humanely, regardless of broader political considerations. The effectiveness of the German westward strategy in preserving soldier lives provides empirical support for the argument that commanders acted correctly in prioritizing subordinate survival over abstract military honor. The 2.8 million German soldiers who surrendered to Western forces survived the war at rates above 99%. This represents approximately 2.7 million lives preserved through command decisions that violated traditional military ethics but achieved the practical goal of soldier survival. The German experience in spring 1945 provides important lessons for military strategists and historians studying the relationship between military ethics, soldier morale, and strategic effectiveness. First, the case demonstrates that military organizations facing inevitable defeat may rationally choose strategies that maximize soldier survival rather than strategies that maximize military effectiveness. This calculation becomes particularly important when different surrender options offer dramatically different prospects for prisoner survival. Second, the case shows that effective military communication and intelligence systems can continue to function and provide value even when higher command structures have completely collapsed. Wehrmacht communication networks successfully coordinated the evacuation of millions of soldiers despite the complete breakdown of German political and military authority. Third, the case illustrates the importance of prisoner of war policies in influencing enemy military behavior. Allied policies that provided humane treatment to German prisoners encouraged German forces to surrender rather than fight to the death, thereby reducing casualties on both sides and hastening the war's end. Fourth, the case demonstrates that individual soldiers and small unit commanders may make rational survival decisions that contradict orders from higher authority when those orders appear to serve no useful military purpose. The mass nature of German defection from official surrender policies suggests that such decisions reflect normal human behavior rather than exceptional cowardice or insubordination. These lessons remain relevant for contemporary military operations where similar moral and strategic dilemmas may arise. Military commanders facing defeat must balance abstract concepts of honor and duty against practical considerations of subordinate welfare and mission accomplishment. The German experience suggests that commanders who prioritize subordinate survival, while maintaining unit cohesion and discipline, may serve their nation's long-term interests more effectively than commanders who insist on fighting to the death when no strategic purpose can be achieved. The statistics of German surrender in 1945 provide a stark illustration of how political decisions and military policies directly affect individual human lives on a massive scale. 2.8 million German soldiers surrendered to Western Allied forces and experienced a mortality rate of approximately 1% in captivity. 3.06 million German soldiers were captured by Soviet forces and experienced a mortality rate of 35.8% in captivity. These numbers represent real people. Fathers, sons, brothers, and husbands whose survival or death was determined by political decisions made in Moscow, Washington, London, and Berlin. The German soldiers who chose to surrender westward were not making abstract strategic calculations. They were making desperate personal decisions based on fragmentary information and uncertain hope. The success of their choice validated the terrible mathematics of survival that governed the final months of World War II in Europe. For these soldiers, the war's end was not about victory or defeat, ideology or politics, honor or shame. It was about living long enough to see home again. The 2.7 million German soldiers who survived Western Allied captivity returned to Germany and contributed to the reconstruction of democratic institutions and the economic miracle of the 1950s and 1960s. Their children and grandchildren became citizens of a prosperous, democratic, and peaceful German state that has been America's ally for more than 70 years. The approximately 700,000 German soldiers who died in Soviet captivity left behind widows and orphans whose lives were shaped by loss and bitterness that influenced German attitudes toward the Soviet Union and communism for generations. These human consequences of political and military decisions in 1945 demonstrate the enduring importance of leadership choices in determining not only immediate military outcomes but also the long-term development of nations and peoples. The German westward migration of spring 1945 was ultimately successful because German commanders and soldiers correctly calculated that their survival depended on reaching American and British rather than Soviet custody. This calculation saved approximately 2.7 million German lives and contributed to the rapid reconstruction of democratic Germany as an ally of the Western democracies. The story of this migration is therefore not only a tale of military desperation and individual courage, but also an example of how strategic choices made under extreme pressure can have positive long-term consequences that extend far beyond the immediate circumstances that motivated them. In the end, the German soldiers who chose to run west in spring 1945 were running toward more than just survival. They were running toward a future in which Germany would become a peaceful, democratic, and prosperous member of the Western Alliance. Their choice to surrender to American and British forces rather than Soviet forces was a choice for the kind of Germany that would emerge from the ruins of the Third Reich. This choice was made by individual soldiers and small unit commanders who had no way of knowing the long-term consequences of their actions. They were simply trying to survive. But their individual survival decisions, aggregated across millions of people, helped determine the political and strategic landscape of Europe for the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. The mathematics of survival in spring 1945 were therefore also the mathematics of European reconstruction, German democratization, and ultimately the peaceful reunification of Germany under democratic institutions aligned with the Western Alliance. The German soldiers who made the desperate choice to run west were running toward their own survival. But they were also running toward the survival of democratic values and institutions in Central Europe. Their success in reaching American and British lines rather than Soviet custody was therefore not only a personal triumph but also a strategic victory for democratic forces in the emerging Cold War struggle. This is why the story of the German westward migration in spring 1945 remains relevant to contemporary strategic thinking about the relationship between individual human choices and broader historical developments. Sometimes, the most important strategic decisions are made not by political leaders or military commanders, but by ordinary soldiers making desperate personal choices under extreme pressure. The cumulative effect of millions of individual choices to seek survival through surrender to democratic rather than totalitarian forces helped shape the post-war world in ways that continue to influence international relations today. The German Federal Republic, NATO, the European Union, and the peaceful reunification of Germany all have historical roots that can be traced back to the desperate choices made by German soldiers in the spring of 1945. In this sense, the German westward migration was more than a military retreat or a humanitarian crisis. It was a founding event in the creation of the democratic, prosperous, and peaceful Europe that emerged from the ruins of World War II. The soldiers who chose to run west were not only saving their own lives but also contributing to the salvation of democratic civilization in Central Europe. Their story deserves to be remembered not only as an example of military desperation and individual courage, but also as evidence of how ordinary people making extraordinary choices under impossible circumstances can contribute to positive historical change that extends far beyond their immediate circumstances. The mathematics of survival in spring 1945 were ultimately the mathematics of hope. The hope that democratic values and institutions could survive and flourish even after the complete collapse of the political order that had governed Europe for centuries. The German soldiers who chose survival over death, West over East, democracy over totalitarianism, made that hope possible for future generations. This is their lasting legacy and the ultimate significance of their desperate choice to race west toward American and British lines in the spring of 1945. They were running for their lives, but they were also running toward a better future for themselves, their families, and their nation. That they succeeded in reaching that future is one of the most important and least understood strategic outcomes of World War II in Europe.